everyone. Welcome to another episode of Adventures in DevOps. We are recording this probably about a month before it's released, so we are very much hoping the world is going to be in a better state than it is right now in mid-February with the coronavirus. I am Nell Shamrell Harrington, coming to you from my home, of course, of Seattle, Washington. And with me, as always, are our panelists. First up, let's go to Tyler. Tyler, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. We actually had an earthquake earlier this morning.
Oh my goodness!
So everyone's adding to the little gasoline to the fire. But yeah, we're doing pretty good, and so far so good.
Cool. Scott, how about you? How are things in Oregon?
Good. Just hunkering down, restricted on travel, all kinds of fun stuff like that. But yeah, focusing on a lot of IAM these days. So it's a good thing we're talking about security today.
Awesome. And Chuck, how's it going?
Going well. I felt the same earthquake Tyler did. So yeah, I woke up. What are the kids doing? Wait, what's the world doing? And yeah, so it shook. But yeah, hopefully we get the world patched for this particular virus, and we can get back to normal.
Great. I certainly hope so too. And we have a special guest with us this week. We have Jeffrey Groman. Did I say that correctly?
You did. You got it perfectly.
Oh, fantastic. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I've been a security practitioner for about 20 odd years. And starting out with, before we called it cyber, and I think we called it network security back in those days or something like that. Then became information security. So I've had a lot of roles. I've been doing security consulting now for the last probably about 15 years or so, doing incident response work, working with red teams, threat hunting, just sort of playing a lot of different roles over the last several years, and just sort of seeing where the trends are and what things are going well and what things, I guess, aren't going so well.
If you're a DevOps engineer, learning is constant. There's always something to keep up on, new technology to manage containers, how to keep everything up to date, what's going on in the Linux ecosystems that you're managing, et cetera, et cetera. Educative.io helps with that. They're a platform made from the ground up with software and DevOps engineers in mind. Instead of making you scrub back and forth through videos and spend hours on setup, their courses are text-based and feature live coding environments so you can skim back and forth like a book and practice in browser as you learn. One of the courses I recommend is a practical guide to Kubernetes. Kubernetes can get a little bit complicated, and this just breaks it down step by step and walks you through the whole process. It's awesome. They have other courses that cover topics from DevOps to machine learning, system design, and much more. And each course has a free preview so you can poke around free of charge. On top of that, you can visit educative.io/adventures to get 10% off any course or subscription. Check it out today.
Great. We are glad to have you here. And I thought we'd start off with kind of a general question. So a slide I've used in presentations, including defense firms, we'll leave it at that, is when you first, when you think you come into a DevOps world, you have the dev saying, it's not my code that's breaking, it's your machines. You have ops saying, it's not my machines, it's your code. And security just says no. So I wonder if you could give us just a little overview. Where does security come into a DevOps organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what really needs to happen is the SEC really needs to sort of become part of all of it, right? We want developers to be thinking about things in a more secure, way. We need operations folks to be thinking about things in a more secure way as well. And we need to sort of break down these silos, right? That's that I think is the penultimate. I mean, how many times I can tell you in both, we see more on the red team side where we see things happening sort of live in real time. Where an application might be really well constructed from or architected from a authorization, authentication standpoint, but then we see things like the underlying OS in production is not all that well patched, or there's services running on it that still have default credentials, but they're not really being used. They were set up at one point, people forgot about them, so you have developers who aren't really thinking about that, not really paying attention to that. And it's sort of divorced from the operations folks who are probably focused on other things. And, and it really gets complicated when you take, DevOps, and then you say, well, this is also a vendor managed or maintained environment, like let's say it's something like Teradata or something else that's sort of big and complex and sort of vendorish, then you have more of that finger pointing, because now the vendors and they're saying, oh, hey, I don't have to deal with it. That's really the vendor's problem. So unfortunately, that's sort of where we are today.
Have you guys read Ghost in the Wires? Because this reminds me a little bit of that, where most of his was either, you found some technical thing where you could like freak the phone with a whistle, or, it was, you would go and you would exploit the cracks, right? And that's where we're talking, but you would exploit the cracks where it was, well, Johnny in department A doesn't know Susie in department B. And so he finds out just enough about Susie to call Johnny up and say, Johnny, I need access to the server. Right. And so that's what we're talking about here, where it's, okay, there's, instead of making sure that we overlap, everybody's trying to cover their own rear end. And so what winds up happening is you have this gap, because I don't want to conflict with ops over the ops responsibility, so I'm not going to get close. Ops doesn't want to conflict with dev over their responsibility, so they don't get close to that. And you have this gap in the middle where people actually move in and find the exploits to that, right? So, and that's the things like the database credentials, or the patch levels on certain things. And it could be libraries, which to me, in some of the places that I've worked, really do fall into that, right? Because ops is responsible for having the library on the machine, but dev is actually what's using it. And so, they kind of hands off. It doesn't get updated. There's an exploit to it. And there you go.
Yeah, absolutely. Just another sort of example to throw out there was we were doing some testing a while back on an API. Again, this is internally facing, so this is for folks that are on the inside of their network. And the idea was that they were using certificates for authentication, and so you were supposed to authenticate to the API via an F5. And we said, well, what happens if we just connect directly to a Tomcat port on one of the various instances? And sure enough, nothing stopped us. So we just sort of bypassed that. And no one really thought about that. Well, what happens if we just bypass the F5? So there's a lot of these sort of examples that, and to that point, it's, no one really sort of thinks about, or, sort of takes that holistic threat model and says, hey, if I were a bad guy, what would I try to do? And I think that's part of what's also missing, is that, that holistic threat modeling that we all should be doing and thinking about.
Yeah, that reminds me of a talk that a colleague of mine just gave about all of the holes in the Cloud Foundry platform. And as you just mentioned a few minutes ago, people don't pay attention to the operating system layer very much. And that's one of the strengths of Cloud Foundry, is that they actually curate what they call a stem cell. And the stem cell then allows you to roll that out to all of your VMs. But to loop back to what you just mentioned, the question that I have for you is, how much of the security awareness in breaking down the silos and giving everybody a little bit of responsibility, how do you do that when you manage going to a client or to different people and say, okay, well, the dev team needs to be aware of these few things, the ops team need to be aware of this, and then your security team does the rest? How do you usually divide that up?
Yeah, and I think you're sort of hitting the nail on the head there, is that I think, the silos exist, and the silos are built on these sort of management silos. So I think they're also following the lead of their own managers, who are also sort of saying, hey, this is my turf. This isn't your turf. And I think that's part of the problem. I once, I was reading, talking about, sort of books that, and sort of where they lead you. I don't know if you guys have seen Team of Teams by Jeremy McChrystal, right?
One of my top 3 business books.
Yeah, and it's amazing, because I believe it was in that. I've been reading so much lately, but I think it was in there that it was sort of touched on this idea that, way back when, probably in the 60s, they looked at, from an application development standpoint, they looked at the structure of your, sort of an HR structure could also sort of predict what the limitations of any architecture that you were going to build. Like, you can't really sort of get out of the constraints of your HR environment. They're sort of that sort of locks you in place. And I think that that's part of the problem, is that, from the standpoint of the technical folks, no one really wants to sort of push somebody else's manager or director or, and stomp on their feet or on their turf. And I think that's part of the problem too, that we really need to sort of break down is, we can start to train people and teach people and get people to think about security. But I think if those barriers exist, no one's going to really want to try and push too hard.
I mean, from a DevOps practice perspective, it's, we oftentimes talk about security is about building quality into the system. And so by making everything code, you are securing things through the automation. You're also making it so that when you discover these holes that you make those changes, you test that that you've resecured these things, and then every time the deployment happens, whether it's building a newer environment or whatever, it should be remediating or reinforcing those decisions over and over again. And so your quality, hopefully the intent is that it continues to get better and better and better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that paradigm really, I think we've seen that it really works well when you're talking about like cloud development and cloud deployments today, where I think just sort of naturally, you don't have some of those barriers we were just talking about. You don't have some of those silos because you have people sort of working together. It's all sort of gets munged together. When you're talking about like, deploying something out to AWS or Azure or whatever. And unfortunately that, how do we translate that back to what's going on in your own data center? I think that's, a problem, unfortunately, that it doesn't, then it gets separated back out to what we were talking about. But I think what's also interesting is sort of the counter example where you've traditionally been deploying everything internally, and then you start to move to the cloud and you try to sort of figure out, well, who's responsible for what and how do we deploy this stuff? And I don't want to get, sort of way beyond my own bounds, but I feel like things like the Capital One hack from last year, I feel like that's really what that was. I mean, there are so many really good ways to secure AWS environments, and roles can be so granular. But if you don't understand how to set up roles, you end up doing what we've always seen in the past with IT, which is that, well, we'll just give you everything, right? And that'll make it work because you've got all the permissions that exist, right? Everything, it's your root or your whatever analogy you want to use. And I think that's, again, I think that's where we see the problems also fall through when we look at like cloud deployments, is that everything becomes, we get these like S3 buckets that are world readable or world writable, or Mongo databases that are, also exposed to the internet with just, full permissions and that sort of thing. And so we're getting away from what you were just talking about, like having that quality, having that sort of sense of, we're putting this together holistically and we're going to iterate until we get it right.
Yeah.
I very much remember the Capital One hack you mentioned. And the reason that stands out so much in my mind is I believe I remember it was because the S3 bucket security controls were not configured correctly. And the thing about S3 at that point, at least, I have no idea if it's changed, is it's not secure by default. It's open by default. And so there's kind of a false sense of security. People, deploying stuff to the cloud and thinking AWS is just going to take care of the security things. No, AWS takes care of this physical security of the machines in the data center, but that's where they're responsive. That's the line of their responsibilities. That's where it ends.
Yeah. So specifically to the AWS, kind of the default has always been that it's closed by default. But what they actually added was this. And it's funny because I'm not remembering what it is, but there's now these 4 options that you have to uncheck that lets you know that by doing these things you are making it way easier. Because right now, like if you create a new bucket, there's all these, it's going to basically give you all these warnings and saying you can't do these things because now this is completely locked down. And
gotcha.
And so it's funny because at some level, yes, these options enforce this or make it very much more explicit that you're making these mistakes or whatever, but it's just funny how that is where all these vectors have, most of these hacks that have happened are around the S3 bucket, misconfiguration.
And it's funny too, because you're thinking, no, I'll just check the box that says it's okay. I'm a professional. I know what I'm doing. But it's the professionals that make these mistakes because they're paying attention to the next level up or the next thing on the list, and they just assume that this is done properly. It's the assumption that gets you.
Yeah, you just get busy. It's just so easy to get busy doing other things, right? And you just, I'm going to do this temporarily, and then next thing you know, somebody else maybe uploads something to that bucket that has customer data in it, and now all of a sudden you've created a reportable incident.
Yeah, I did a quick search for those different access control mechanisms, and I didn't see security through obscurity in any of them. That's what it seems like most people think are. It's like if you just name your S3 bucket because it has to be globally unique, some sort of random GUID type thing, that doesn't necessarily make you secure, because at some point, some page is going to reference that, and it's going to leak just that part of it.
And there's automated scanners that are looking for open S3 buckets today. So,
yeah. So I personally think, Jeffrey, that there is like a threshold for a size of a company where you add ops or DevOps. So you might have a startup that's fairly small and they basically use 5 servers and they have 10 people. And then at a certain point, they grow to a point where they actually need to hire the ops team. Do you feel like there is a size of a company that you've seen where not only do they have to have the ops team, but they also have to have the sec team?
Yeah, I think that's, traditionally in like companies, we would look at, very small businesses like what you're describing and say, yeah, they probably wouldn't need a security team because there's not a lot of, internal infrastructure there to sort of manage. But when you're talking about strictly development, that's where I think once you're talking about developing complex applications, and it really doesn't matter, I guess, the size of your team necessarily. It's really depending on what the nature of the application is, how it's being used. Because at some point, and again, it gets back to that threat modeling that you have to look at it and say, well, what could the bad guys do with this? And I mean, you could be a 2-person company and need to have security expertise coming in and, or having it in-house and figuring out what's going on. Yeah, again, it just sort of throws everything off. Like all the sort of traditional things that we've thought about can really change drastically.
Early in my career, I figured out which jobs were worth working at and which ones weren't, mostly by trial and error. I created a system that I used to find jobs and later contracts as a freelancer. If you're looking for a job or trying to figure out where you should go next, then check out my book, The Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. The book walks you through figuring out what you want, vetting companies that meet your criteria, meeting that company's employees, and getting them to recommend you for a job. Don't settle for whoever has listed their job on the job board. Go out and proactively find the job you'll love. Buy the book at devchat.tv/jobbook. That's devchat.tv/jobbook.
So, yeah, you talk about threat modeling. That's not a term that I work with in more of the operations side of thing, but I'm curious about that. Can you expand more on what a threat model is and how you generate or create those? Yeah,
definitely. So I think, from the security standpoint, or, if you ask a security practitioner what a threat model is, some of these folks will say, well, they'll start to talk about very formal models that you use for threat modeling. Microsoft has theirs. There's several out there, and some of them have tools. Like Microsoft actually has a tool that you can use, where you can sort of put together graphically, UML or something like that, and sort of build your application, and then they'll actually run various scenarios through it and sort of spit out some answers. And there's some really complicated ways to do that. But I think fundamentally what we're really talking about is, getting the entire team around a whiteboard. I mean, I've done it this way many times, and just sort of talking this out. Like, okay, first question is, what's the most valuable stuff within this application? It's probably it's probably going to be the data, but it may not be. It might be access into an environment or something like that. It might just be a stepping stone for some purpose. So really trying to get to that. What is that valuable, what's the most valuable piece of all of this? Part of it also, from the security standpoint, means you have to be able to answer that question. And that actually isn't always obvious. For example, in the last couple of years, we've seen a tremendous increase in the number of what we call supply chain attacks, where a company or an application is being attacked, not because that company or that application is all that interesting, but because it becomes a way into the more interesting, companies or interesting data or something like that. So a good example, Reuters did a huge piece on this last year about a Chinese threat actor who had taken over these big companies, like HPE was one of them. I mean, we're talking about big companies doing it because they provide managed services. So no one really cared about HPE and what they had personally or as a company. But the fact that they had through managed services meant that they probably had direct network connections into all of their customers, meant that I could easily from there hop into dozens of companies and probably unfettered. And many times these are not even firewalled or anything else, like all services allowed type of a situation. So when we see that sort of a thing, another example is when we've seen software companies where that's been hit. Like CCleaner, if you guys remember that, piece of software, right, for sort of cleaning malware. So CCleaner got hit a few years ago now. And same thing, it's their repository, software repository was compromised. The attackers were able to put an implant of code, into that, into there. And it was really interesting because we saw that, this is the data came from Avast, who ended up buying CCleaner, right? So they were giving away this data, and they're saying that I can't remember what the numbers were. It was something like, it was tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of downloads. But what they saw was that to get the second stage of malware, that only went to I want to say 40 people, 40 downloads, 40 people, whatever it was. So it was clearly targeted. In other words, they were simply, again, just the supply chainer. And, ultimately, they're going after the people who use that. So, getting back to threat modeling, sort of identifying that. So if I'm CCleaner, I might say, well, there's nothing really interesting about my code base. There's nothing really interesting about my data. But what's really interesting is that I've got, let's say, just to throw out a number, I've got 500 million users. Well, that fact that 500 million people are downloading your piece of software and putting it and running it on their machines could be very interesting. And so I think it's incumbent upon companies to really think about that and to figure out, hey, wait a second here, I got to put a little bit more focus on this because maybe it's just a small utility I'm building, but this thing runs with administrative privileges on any Windows box that it's running on. So this could be very interesting to a threat actor.
That's something we very much see in the open source world. Like I was working at Blue Box company. It doesn't exist anymore, but Chuck, remember, this is that's around the time Chuck and I first met. Mm-hmm. And I think we sent you swag.
They sponsored for a long time.
That's right.
Sent me swag. They hosted the website for free for a long time.
Yeah. Well, we also hosted a mirror of Ruby gems, and I remember the day there. I don't remember which gem it was, but there was a gem that was uploaded, and it had malicious code in it. Yep. And I'm trying to remember the exact details, but I know what they did was they took all of Ruby gems down, and then we and other mirrors helped them try to recreate it back at the point before the malicious code was uploaded into it. And presumably all the other gems downloaded it and had it in their dependencies.
Yeah. We've seen that, I think, with a couple of Git projects too. I mean, that's, again, fairly common sort of, very targeted attack for what they're trying to accomplish. But again, it's just, just understanding that this, what I'm doing can build a mechanism for that. And I think that's the first step to a successful threat model is understand, where the goods are, where the value is to the bad guys. And then it's just trying to figure out, well, what could they do? And that's where the creativity comes in. How would they try to get in? How would they try to succeed at doing whatever it is? And having that, the sort of broadest team available to sort of brainstorm that, and it can be as simple as, like a regular brainstorming session where everyone just sort of jots down ideas, whether they're, it's not about being right or wrong, because sometimes it's hard to figure out. It's the old thing that, truth is stranger than fiction. I mean, some of the stories that we've seen of real attacks, like you just sort of scratch your head like, wow, I would have never thought of that. Or, if I had written about that, no one would have believed me. They would say, that's a bunch of garbage, But, that can happen. So that's really, to me, what threat modeling is. If you want to make it more formalized, if you want to try to sort of take it to the next level where you start to, use tooling around it and you're doing it on a regular cadence and you're checking your current threat model versus your previous threat model, great, more power to you. But since 90% of the people aren't even doing anything, the first step is really just identifying, what's valuable and starting to think about, okay, how do the bad guys get to it?
Yeah, that sounds good. I think that's one of the key takeaways for today is set aside some time to threat model and brainstorm, and then figure out what you can do. The next step I would probably say, and I want to pose this question to you, Jeffrey, is using the story of open source tools coming in and giving those as dependencies. What kind of tools or recommendations do you generally give to teams as far as like maybe putting in a upfront scanner, like scanning artifacts that are coming in, or some sort of runtime scanner that basically says, I'm always scanning for viruses? What are some of the best practices there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a tough one because, you guys have seen this before. I mean, applications can be built on so many, outside libraries that, like, how do you track all that? And, there are projects around there. I know OWASP has, I'm forgetting the tool, that, what it's, and it may only be for like maybe Java applications, or I'm trying to remember what languages they support today, but it basically will, sort of enumerate for you, build a list of the software composition, like all the libraries that your package is built upon. And there are commercial tools that will do this as well. Veracode and others have like these software composition analysis types of tools where they'll take apart your again, whatever it is, whatever your package might be, like a war file or whatever, and look inside of it and say, okay, well, here's a whole list of everything that you're building it on. So that's a great starting point. Whatever you use to do that, just figuring out what that list is important. But then what? To your point, like, okay, great, I know what it is. So now what? To be honest, I don't know that there's anything really foolproof around that. I mean, part of it is going to be, running application scans and testing and pen testing and stuff like that. That is certainly a proactive approach. Not necessarily going to get to, every underlying, certainly, automated scans have a really hard time getting to some of those underlying vulnerabilities. Like a good example of this was, if you guys remember the Struts vulnerabilities that came out like in 2017, that's what Equifax ended up getting hit with. They had an application deployed out and didn't realize it was built on Struts, and it gets popped pretty quickly. But just trying to identify, because automated like network-based scanners couldn't identify that you're running an application, that your Java application is running on Struts. You'd have to really sort of pen test it and figure out, look at it from the application side and say, can I see that the functionality of Struts is being used, right? That's really the only way to sort of know that. So sometimes it's really sort of gets buried in there, and penetration testing is, could be, a good way to sort of figure it out. But I think it also depends on the nature of the application. There isn't just one, solution. And I'll give you an example, something that's been coming out recently. If you guys are familiar, or if you've heard about any of these MageCart, sort of that's the name of a threat actor, or actually it's more like an umbrella of a whole bunch of threat actors. And they got referred to as MageCart. But one of the things, so what they do is they basically put an implant in like an e-commerce site that basically siphons off credit card information and throws it up to a server that the threat actor owns and manages, right? So basically your credit card transaction goes through, but at the same time it siphons off that, and then they collect a whole bunch of it and they monetize it.
It's like a digital skimmer that you be on
exactly
places where you swipe your debit card and such.
Exactly, that's exactly what it is. Electronic skimmer. And one of the means that they have a lot of means for doing this, for how do you get it in there. And one of the means that they use is that they've hit a couple of these like JavaScript library, companies that, sort of build those widgets and such. And you package it, you can package that JavaScript library into your e-commerce site. And you don't even realize that as part of that, you just took some malicious code and it's there. So, I think that's a good example of if that's, your concern. So you're focused on your e-commerce site, right? And you're thinking, well, how do I know if this has been compromised or not? How do I know if somebody put malicious code in? So again, sort of thinking it out, sort of threat modeling it, you say to yourself, well, wait a second here, for that attack to really work, that means that my web server is going to initiate traffic over to some unknown server, right, and deliver it. We don't know what ports, we don't, who knows what the malicious, what that malware might be using. So I don't know that. But I mean, this is one of those things where a firewall could actually block it, right? If you know, right, why should your web server ever be initiating traffic to some unknown IP address? Like that should never happen.
It should be using a whitelist, right, and not just
exactly
saying, "Hey, any IP will do."
Exactly. Any established traffic, great, because that's probably just a user hitting it. But the server itself initiating. So there's other ways to do that. So that doesn't stop you from being, from getting the malware on your machine. But there might be other ways to sort of mitigate the risk by thinking about other controls, like network-based controls. So I think we have to be creative. We have to be just as creative as the bad guys are, and thinking about how do we figure it, because we don't want to get paranoid and just stop, can't stop writing code, but we have to think about like, okay, what might a threat look like, and how could I try and stop that threat? And I think that's really what it is. Instead of just sort of blindly just trying to throw tools at it or something else, it's a tough thing to do. It's the needle in the haystack. So I think a thoughtful approach is probably the best approach.
Yeah. So Jeffrey, to your point about that struts vulnerability and a lot of this. Now, obviously, if the application is not being deployed regularly, it's not going to find this kind of thing. But obviously, there's tools that you can put in your CI/CD pipelines. They're going to scan for these types of things. GitHub actually has, like automated vulnerability detection for open source tools and stuff like that. So I've gotten a bunch of them recently, just this week, related to JavaScript vulnerabilities myself. And It's funny because the GitHub will actually create a pull request if it thinks it can fix it with just a version bump or something like that, and you can
That's awesome.
merge it in. But there's also something called Nexus Lifecycle by a company called Sonatype that actually is definitely doing much more sophisticated stuff. Java, JavaScript, Python, Ruby, Go, all those good things. And you would plug it into your CI/CD pipeline, and it's going to be scanning and looking for those risk vulnerabilities and those types of things. So I'll put that in the show notes as well. So,
yeah, that's great. That's great. I mean, the challenge really is just, you think about all the different, sort of languages and platforms you could be coding on. That's where it just gets, complicated. But, certainly that's, it's good that we're seeing, right, more of just more folks that are just understanding like what some of these problems are and really starting to build some tooling around this. This is at least try to identify it, maybe try to fix it. That's cool.
Yep. So changing topic just a little bit here, but let's say a junior dev or junior ops person came to you. Let's stick with the junior dev for now, and we'll cover the ops later. But junior dev says, I finished Code Academy. I just came out of a coding boot camp. I want to start thinking about security with my code. Where do they start?
Yeah, I mean, the cool thing is that, there's a lot of resources out there. There's so many good security resources out there. There's formalized courses from companies like SANS and others, right? There's just so many. OWASP has a lot of really good information to help people sort of figure this out. I think part of it is just identifying, again, I guess I probably sound like a broken record here, but if you'll use that, part of that sort of aged analogy. But, if you think about the whole idea of threat modeling, that really sort of clues you in on where some of the problems can exist. It's kind of funny, I think it's been 20, maybe even 25 years since SQL injection was initially publicly talked about. in a forum or some kind of a post or something like that. And yet we still see, I mean, if you go to like the CVEs or the NVD, the National Vulnerability Database, you'll still see SQL injection vulnerabilities out there, even though there's so many very, I guess, specific and good ways of avoiding it. And I think, again, it's just people don't realize or don't necessarily realize where some of these vulnerabilities can come from or what can really happen. So again, I think that's really the most important thing. It's not so much, I mean, learning to code securely is important, but I think even more important is understanding why you're coding securely and where you need to code securely. I think what we also tend to find is that people end up sort of bolstering defenses in places that the attackers are already having a really hard time getting to. I mean, one thing that we've found is that attackers don't look for hard challenges. They look for the low-hanging fruit like everybody else, and that's what they go after. So, sort of bolstering security where it's already pretty tight has limited, just diminishing returns at that point. So, trying to figure out where it is and what I need to be thinking about, whether it's something like, I mean, we still see a lot of cross-site scripting, believe it or not. It's another good example. So, sort of taking a step back and figuring out, okay, what could somebody possibly do with cross-site scripting against my application, and what should I be concerned about, and how should we try and deal with that? Or should we just say to ourselves, you know what, it's even if they did it, it wouldn't be that big of a deal, so let's move on to something that's more important. And that's really what we want developers to be thinking about, is what's the most important, and just sort of focusing in on that.
Are you stuck at home climbing the walls when you should be hanging out with the community at the latest conference to get canceled? Are you wondering where to hear your JavaScript heroes like Amy Knight and Douglas Crockford and Chris Heilman? After the cancellations, I decided to put on a JavaScript conference for you, online. I invited my favorite folks from around the web and got them to come speak at an online event just for you. Go to jsremoteconf.com and check out our speakers and schedule. The conference is on May 14th and 15th. The call for proposals is open until March 31st. Come join us at an online conference that we guarantee will keep you safe and keep you informed. jsremoteconf.com.
Yeah, that's really cool. One of the things I love about the security team is about, when I say team, I'm referring to what I'm about to say, red team, blue team, and these kind of things. Yeah. And the community around security is really awesome. And so what I would say to you, my question is, like, what kind of community resources do you recommend to people who they may decide that they want to go into security? Like 10 years ago, I didn't know that I was going to become a DevOps professional because I was still an app developer. But 5 years from now, I might be more of a sec type of guy. If somebody wants to like look into those things, what are some of the community angled type of things that you would recommend?
So, yeah, if somebody were interested in a security career, I would say, I mean, at least, I agree with you. It's hard to really predict where things are going. But the two biggest specialties, because security, like everything else, has become so specialized. And the two biggest specialties we see today are probably red teaming and threat hunting. I think you just mentioned both of those, right? And it's interesting because there's sort of two sides to the same coin, right? One is just, the attacking side, and one is sort of the detection or defending side. But either way, either side that you look at, you really have to understand applications well. You also have to really understand operating systems and operating system internals really well, because it's not always true, but I would say more often than not, we're seeing attacks that end up, hitting, really trying to take over an environment. And the way you do that is by hitting operating systems. So you might start with an application level attack. Maybe you're gaining credentials, or maybe you're using that as an avenue to actually get, remote code exploitation or execution or something like that on the server. And then from there, try to move on to, pivot into something else. But really understanding how operating systems work and function is going to be important, and really understanding underlying network layer protocols is also really important. So I think that that's probably the barrier to entry into security is really having that strong background of understanding what that is and really sort of digging into it. And there's so many resources. If you want to dig into those, there's so many resources available out there, YouTube videos and, blogs on Medium and other places. So it's there. And there's communities. There's so many communities. There's OWASP and so many other local security groups that get together and talk about this. And there's Capture the Flags. And I mean, all these great ways of sort of, getting involved in the security community. But, one thing, I don't know, I could be totally wrong about this. I really feel like what's ultimately going to happen is that we're going to have, sort of smaller security teams at some point, and security really just becomes embedded, within operations and within dev. It has to. Like, this can't be an external component anymore. It's really got to be everybody already understanding the issues and just working on it together. Sort of like, I think what Scott was really talking about at the beginning of the call, where, he was saying that, what we're really trying to do is just sort of build it in from the beginning and then iterate through as we find issues, right? We're always just sort of looking for how do we make it better and better and better. And I think that's where it all has to go. But yeah, I mean, those are, some of the things that I think about, when I give advice to like younger folks who want to try and get into security, or, sometimes it's like even experienced folks like, what, I'm just ready for a new challenge. I'm ready to try and do something different. And, there's a lot of, there's certainly a lot of opportunities out there.
Yeah, people need to pay attention to feeling bored. If you feel bored with your job, that means you need a new aspect. And so maybe the new aspect is going back to app development, and going into a different specialty. And so I like that.
So I dropped 2 recommendations into the chat that'll be in the show notes, but there's something called, and I've not used these personally, these are just things that have been recommended to me from my coworkers at Stelligent. Offensive Security and hackthebox.eu are 2 places that you can get training. One, I think, is Hack the Box is more on penetration testing, and Offensive Security, I think they actually have like courses and certifications.
They do. They have really good certifications. Offensive Security has some of the most like recognized and respected certifications now in the industry. Like, as you start to gain those, like that's a huge amount of credibility to put on your resume.
Cool.
That ties into a question that I had that maybe could, wrap things up for us a little bit, which is, if you were building a security team for an organization, what would you look for to build your team?
Hey, good. That's a great question. I think we're just sort of touching on some of those aspects. I think it's people who want to learn, want new challenges, want to dig into things and just understand how they work. I think that's really what got me into security in the first place. Was to get into security, you really had to understand how stuff works. And again, it goes across the board. It's not just about understanding how the application works, or how about, how does the operating system work, or how does the network work. It's really, a combination of all 3, of really all the layers. So I think that sort of just, sort of creativity, innovation, those are things that we want to see in security people. And just that sort of enthusiasm to want to learn new things, and who are willing to sort of dig into things, and fail and keep trying, right? You fail, you didn't figure it out, or, the red team exercise didn't work. So great, let's learn from that and let's do better the next time. I mean, I think those are the types of people, and it doesn't really matter where they're coming from or, what their backgrounds are. If they've got some of those skills and knowledge and they're really willing to sort of dig in and learn more, and I think the other piece of it is, that's really the technical side. The other side of it is really the communication side. Too often.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, too often we talk in our own lingo and nobody understands it. And I catch myself doing it. I catch other people doing it. I mean, it's one of the examples. I did a lunch and learn a year or 2 ago, and I started with this, and I've done it a few times now. I said, security people are notoriously terrible at talking to application developers. Like, we'll talk about cross-site scripting and we'll show you an alert box, a JavaScript alert box, as if somehow that JavaScript alert box is supposed to tell you guys that this is like the worst thing in the world. And I'm sure as a developer, you look at that like, who cares? But that's how we're communicating. And so many pen testing reports over the years have that's what they've used as an example. And I just feel like that's an example of where we as security people look at that and say, hey, I was able to do something I'm not supposed to be able to do. But to the rest of the world, they look at that and say, it's a little box that says XSS. What is that supposed to mean? So I think, communications is the other piece that's really important, especially today, where everything's so technical. We all have our own lingo, and we all have to really be able to understand and really communicate well to each other so that we get those folks to understand that, hey, this is why it's important. This is what the bad guys are doing. This is why we all got to sort of listen to this and sort of do our part and focus on it.
I had one more question along those lines before we move to picks, and that was, I don't see this as often now, but I'm thinking of the book The Phoenix Project, where there was a security engineer who it seemed thought his job was to keep the company secure, but he kept on putting things in place that made the company cease to function. And if the company's not functioning, there's no point to it. And it's something I've seen not as much lately, but I have seen in the field before. Like I've had someone tell me, well, if I had my way, we would just have the computers in a hermetically sealed box that no one could ever go in. Well, yeah, that might be secure, but again, the business can't function when that happens. So what kind of advice do you give companies to use these secure practices, but still be able to function as a business?
Yeah, so I think it's, that from a security standpoint, when you talk about, you didn't ask me, when Tyler asked about, what types of people I want to hire in the security team, I think the other question to ask is, what kind of security leaders do you want to hire? And I think you want a security leader who's going to sort of step in and say, security, like cybersecurity, is business risk. And until you can tie the two together, you're going to get that sort of disconnect where cybersecurity risk is being focused on too much or too little. It has to be married together. I mean, we've seen very few examples of where a cyber attack made a business go under, like they folded up and they were gone. Like that's real business risk. Real business risk means that we will not be able to pay our people or service our clients or, run our business. And I think security people need to understand that's the bottom line, is that it's all about business risk. And so you have to, again, sort of filter how we think about, the security controls we want to put in place. Well, if they're going to hamper the business, then we're adding more business risk than we're taking away. And you're right. I think that's led to a lot of times you have all these security policies and then you have all these policy exceptions because the policies don't work. If you have a whole bunch of policy exceptions, that should indicate to you that something is wrong with the policy, or that you just have a tremendous amount of technical debt. It could be one or the other, or it could be both. But I think that's the sort of the mindset that you want in somebody, is to say, all right, let's figure this out. Let's work together and say, from a business risk standpoint, what does this mean, and what risks are we willing to take on? And sometimes that is that we're willing to take on risk that could lead to a compromise. But what do we do then? Do we have all the pieces in place? Are we prepared to handle a compromise if and when it happens? And that might be a very valid way to think about managing cybersecurity.
All right. Well, thank you. Really enjoyed talking to you
absolutely.
This episode. And let's go ahead and move on to picks. Something we do at the end of each episode is we mention each of us one or two things that we've found useful over the past couple of weeks, or think that our listeners would find useful. And my first is a presentation. It was given at Black Hat last year by Kelly Shortridge and Dr. Nicole Forsgren, and it was called the something chaos: the inevitable marriage of DevOps and security. The content is fantastic, and additionally, the styling on the slides is absolutely ace. So I will put a link to those slides in the show note. Highly recommended. I think there's videos of other times the talk has been given. It's a really, really good intro into DevSecOps, whether you're on kind of the business side or the technical side, and how they need to work together. The second one is I've been inside a lot, like the rest of the world, it seems. So I've been watching a lot of Netflix, and my favorite show I've seen recently is The Witcher on Netflix. The story is cool. People say, is it Game of Thrones? Like, no, it's different. Story is cool. I haven't read the novels or played the game, so it's all new to me. And some of the individual performances by some of the actors are absolutely fantastic. So highly recommend that. If you are still quarantined when you're hearing this, definitely check out The Witcher on Netflix. And with that, let's go ahead and go to Tyler.
All right, great. We had talked about spoiler, we had talked about SQL injections, and I mentioned Bobby drop tables, which is an XK. How do you pronounce that?
Yeah,
XKCD. I always memorize it wrong. I know where to find it, but I'm a bit dyslexic with some of those letters. And so that's my number one pick, is to kind of visualize what a SQL injection was when we're thinking about the history of security. And, even the history of computers is only a few decades old, right? And then my second one is to actually talk about one of the tools I use the most, which is called BOSH. And BOSH is a recursive algorithm, or a recursive name for BOSH Outer Shell. And BOSH Outer Shell was developed by VMware, spun out into Pivotal, and then Pivotal got bought by VMware, so they kind of went waffled back and forth there. And it's a great tool, but it's not just a configuration management tool, it's a lifecycle management tool. And it uses a concept called stem cells. And stem cells are a very good blue team type of defensive way to replace and refresh your VMs, so you're constantly getting patches to the underlying VM vulnerabilities. And that comes for free with BOSH. And that's one of the things I love most about BOSH. That's what I was working on a lot today, was just simple patching, but it's almost bulletproof. It just almost always works. I can't give it a 100% accuracy, because nothing ever always works, but it works so much of the time that you barely ever see it not work. So stem cells is my other pick for today. And I don't have any other pop culture things, because other than Minecraft, that's my main go-to during the shelters. So thanks.
Awesome. How about you, Scott?
All right. So I'm going to start off with the, situationally relevant. There's a Netflix series called Pandemic, and it's basically just kind of like a documentary. It's multiple episodes, and hour long. I think it's pretty interesting. Kind of gives you a little more in depth of things like Ebola and stuff like that. I've also read a bunch of books, and I've given other picks related to this. So that'll be in the show notes. I also will give a lighter suggestion. If you are an Amazon Prime member, there's a documentary just called Sriracha that's really, really cool about the guy who invented, or basically brought sriracha from Vietnam to the US. And it's like 30 minutes. It's a great thing you can watch while you're eating dinner or whatever. And because my last pick is going to be, if you don't use a password manager yet, please switch to using a password manager. There's free open source things like KeePass. And you can install it on Linux, Windows, Mac. If you are going to want passwords on your phone, I would say use something like Dashlane, which is definitely multi-platform. I think 1Password is Mac only. I will end with a caveat that do not use LastPass whatsoever, ever. Do not use it. They're constantly being compromised. Don't use it. Find something else. So, and I might have like I said, I think somebody was jumping in to maybe correct me on whether LastPass is multi-platform.
1Password is multi-platform.
Is it? Okay. I wasn't sure.
It may have started off as being Mac only.
Yeah, definitely did. So, yeah.
And Chuck, how about you?
Yeah, I've got a couple of picks. So I am working on some remote conferences for obvious reasons. I mean, we're quarantined, right? Or we're at least trying to be. As we record this, I have the JavaScript one together. By the time this goes out, I should have, I'm seriously considering doing a DevSecOps one. I am definitely going to be doing a DevOps one. Go to devchat.tv/conferences, and you'll be able to see it there. I'm also working on setting up online meetups. Currently, I kind of started with our bigger audiences. So that was JavaScript, Ruby, Angular, React, and Vue. React Native is definitely in the works. it just takes time to run them all. And so it's a matter of getting them up and running. I would love to do a DevOps one. If you're interested in either helping me find speakers, helping me find a sponsor, helping me just make it run, we can probably get something together. And yeah, I've just gotten emails, hey, we canceled the meetup. And I'm just like, oh man, people need this stuff. So I'm just putting it out there. Folks, I really want us all getting together. I really want to see us, come together as a community. And kind of in that vein, I guess my other pick is just all of the great things that people are doing for each other during this whole coronavirus thing, right? I mean, I have seen a couple of Facebook groups pop up that are like, hey, look, we all live within a half hour of each other. That's basically Utah County, where I live. We all live within a half hour of each other. If you have extra stuff, extra medicine, extra toilet paper, extra whatever, right? Post it here. And if you need something, then post it here so somebody else who has it can get it to you, right? And I've seen and heard stories of people dropping stuff off at strangers' houses or finding out that there's an older person that lives around them, right? And basically going to the grocery store for them and dropping stuff off, right? Basically with a container of Clorox wipes so they can wipe it down before they bring it in if they're that concerned, right? And I mean, just things like that. And, let's all take care of each other. In the tech community, let's take care of each other. In the wider world community, let's take care of each other. If you have an older neighbor, check on them, take care of each other. I mean, that kind of stuff. And people are already doing a great job of this in a lot of ways. But yeah, I mean, that's my pick, is really just that people are great.
Awesome. Jeffrey, how about you?
Right. So, yeah, one thing I would definitely recommend taking a look at is the MITRE attack matrix. Really the whole project. If you haven't looked at attack, ATT, and then like the ampersand CK. So it's open out there. It's free to access. It's a really collaboration between MITRE and just the security community. But it is so much information, so many tools. You can learn so much from it, and you can also build your whole red team and threat hunting capability by using that, sort of mapping to that. It's just a great resource. And there's the Attack Con that happened, I think, last fall. So all their like the videos have been posted, and so much good information out there. If you just want to learn more about security and threat modeling and sort of the threat intelligence, like what's going on out there, what do the attacks look like, what are the threat actors doing, there's so much great information right there. So definitely highly recommend taking a look at that and leveraging it within your environment. Yeah, I think that's the best recommendation I can give, but I certainly second what Chuck was saying, that let's all just look out for each other.
Absolutely.
And
go ahead.
I forgot to plug my own thing. I created a free course on Udemy for AWS's Cloud Development Kit, which allows you to do infrastructure as code to build your infrastructure on AWS. And so I created a free course. It's about 30 minutes long. It's on Udemy. It's in the show notes. It's called Introduction to CDK. So check that out as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Alrighty. Well, thank you, everyone. As Chuck said, please take care of each other in this time and beyond. And we will be back in your ears next week. Take care.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.